This is going to be the fourth part of the lecture on global climate change. With the global climate change, we have experienced that the poles are warming faster, heating faster than the rest of the planet. Studies show this could be as much as as much as 4 degrees. Well, some estimates even suggest a little higher, but a reasonable estimate would be like a 4-degree increment of the pole sea surface temperature compared to rest of the planet. Um, and this results in many other consequences. One of them that you are well aware of is disappearing glaciers, right, in mountain glaciers as well as Arctic glaciers. Um, and the photograph you see is actually from comparison of a glacier from Alaska, right, from 1941 to 2004. In 2004, instead of a glacier, you are actually seeing a lake. So that kind of situations have been reported elsewhere as well. The next photograph you see to the right is from a retreating glacier in Greenland, um, and you can see that actually the glacial margin is gradually retreating, and the glacier is almost forming a new river. So these kind of phenomena, glacial melting phenomena, completely not only it alters the snow and ice cover on the planet, and you know that snow cover is important to reflect back most of the heat, right? And you do know that melting snow and melting ice actually absorbs heat better, so it actually could creates a positive feedback, worsening um, the temperature retention within the Earth's atmosphere. Aside from that, it's a major change in the landscape, right? It creates new aquatic habitats, lakes that may or may not actually last. And in some of those melting glaciers results in lakes temporary or rivers temporary, and soon they dry out. So they are not even actually creating new habitats. They actually convert um, snow-covered grounds into barren lands. That's what we are observing in most of the places right now upon retreating glaciers. Retreat, Similar to retreating glaciers, we are also observing melting permafrost, mostly within the northern latitudes. I will talk a little bit more about that in the next slides. And with the melting permafrost, we are also experiencing many damages, not only to the ecosystem but also to buildings and like houses, and also subterranean structures like pipelines and electricity infrastructure. I'll talk about that damage in the next slide and onward. Before I talk about a little bit more about permafrost, let me finish talking about what's happening with the glacier retreat. This is happening all over the world. Earlier, we saw a couple of examples from the northern hemisphere. Now we are looking at stuff from the southern hemisphere. In Argentina, right, particularly in the Argentinian mountain ranges, you do find those extensive glaciers, right? And in 1920s, you see this extensive snow-covered, ice-covered glacier covering mountain tops as well as valleys. And in the bottom image in 2004, that's actually more than 10 decades ago from today, the glacier has retreated. You can clearly see the snow cover is now mostly limited to the mountain tops, and the snow cover in the mountain foothills and the valleys are disappearing and giving into lakes. And those lakes, as you can imagine, will soon dry out as the melting water will run down the mountain. Um, The same incident has been already observed in the northwestern US, in the northwestern Americas, within the Olympic National Park, where the Blue Glacier is retreating. If you look at the two red arrows, right, that actually shows um, areas where parts of the glacier has been completely gone. Bringing up more evidence from other parts of the world now to glaciers of the mountain of Kilimanjaro. So, and again, as you can see here, in between 1912 to 2002, how much glacier has disappeared. um, so okay, what is the problem with disappearing glaciers? Well, we are looking at the mountain tops, right? Those are extremely high, high altitude mountains, right? You are kind of going past the tundra areas, going past the alpine tundra to get into glaciers. So the importance of glaciers is that glaciers, are simply packs of snow and ice that have accumulated over a long period. Because a glacier accumulation happens in areas that does not undergo complete thawing or melting for a longer period of time, these areas accumulate a lot of ice and ice and snow in form of a glacier. So what happens generally during summer and during warmer seasons, these glaciers slowly starts to melt, and that melting glaciers produce glacier streams that actually runs down the stream and gets into the and which feeds into the lower lands. So most of the rivers in the world, particularly in mountainous areas as well as in the temperate zone, most of those streams are fed by, not by groundwater, those are fed by melting glaciers. So if the glaciers melt completely, the rivers will run out of water, and that will impact all the downstream habitat, the entire stream habitat. It will impact the floodplain, it will impact all the riparian vegetation, it will impact all the riparian wetlands, any wildlife, permanently or temporary, associated with that river, right? And it could even have impacts on the human society. What if there is a dam um, that impounds a river, making a reservoir that is important for agriculture or for producing water for human consumption or for electricity generation? Well, um, if the glacier melts, the river will not flow anymore, so there will be not enough water to sustain those socio-economical activities. So melting glaciers is actually losing an important source of water. So it can have major impacts at global scale. Now let's talk about what happens with disappearing permafrost. I briefly mentioned what that is, but I didn't go into details. Now, what is permafrost in the first place? Um, Permafrost is actually the frozen ground or frozen soil or frozen component of the subterranean soil that remain frozen for more than 2 years. In other words, this is actually kind of a mixture of rocks, different types of soil particles, sand and sediment and ice, right? In fact, permafrost holds the soil particles, the soil structure together, right? It's extremely important to create ground stability. So what we are experiencing is actually with the global warming, right? The atmospheric temperature or the ground surface temperature could be warm enough to melt the permafrost completely in certain cases or partially in some cases. So this has been observed heavily in all over the areas you have permafrost. Particularly, this effect has been notable um, in parts of Alaska and the rest of the Arctic Circle. So because of permafrost melting, what happens is the ground loses its stability. As a result, you can actually observe damage to the infrastructure. Buildings could collapse, houses could collapse, right? You will see splitting in the walls, and also the road infrastructure can also get damaged. And because of the what when permafrost melts, the ground collapses underneath it. As a result, the road could look like some sort of a roller coaster, because like in certain parts where the permafrost melts, the road sinks, right? And if it doesn't melt, it actually kind of keeps the keeps its normal level. So overall, the road may look like a roller coaster with the permafrost melting. And certain permafrosts in the world are about could be as much as 1,000 years old. meaning it has never melted completely in 1,000 years. And meaning that kind of old permafrost are thick. It could be about as much as 5,000 feet in thickness. So, what is the benefit? What's the advantage, ecological value of these kind of this permafrost formations? Um, Permafrost, stores tons and tons of carbon within the frozen substrates, right? So, what happens here is actually when plants and animals and other forms of organic life die, if freezing happens before the decomposition, right, and the sedimentation follows up immediately after, those dead organic matter will not undergo decomposition. They will remain frozen within the permafrost. So all that carbon will not undergo decomposition. So that will not add more gaseous forms of carbon to the atmosphere. So it prevents accumulation of greenhouse gases. Current estimations suggest at least permafrost in the planet Earth hold about 1,500 billion tons of carbon, which is more than double the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide that we have in this decade. Now, when thawing happens in the permafrost, all of that partially decomposed or undecomposed organic matter is exposed to the atmosphere, and it will interact with oxygen partly or fully, depending on the level of oxygen available for the decomposition. Thawing permafrost could release massive amounts of carbon dioxide and methane back to the atmosphere. And also, when permafrost is thawing, right, the ground becomes unstable. So these Arctic landscapes that are mostly covered by wetlands and tundra can turn into barren lands, or something is known as thaw slumps. If you look at the top two images, I'm actually showing you two photographs of what looks like a close-up and an aerial photograph of a thaw slump, right? So thaw slump simply is a collapsed ground, and like I mentioned to you earlier, it's just a barren land. The vegetation cannot root there. The soil is quite unstable, sometimes waterlogged, right? Um, and with time the water could drain, but the soil, exposed soil, is not suitable for growth of vegetation or for any form of wildlife. So it could also, so with that it could impact the Arctic wildlife a lot. So um I earlier mentioned that permafrost formation happens largely within the Arctic. So, to be a little bit more, to put it in a much more broader context, permafrost are found overwhelmingly in the northern hemisphere. Within the northern hemisphere, needless to iterate, within the high altitudes as well as high latitudes, right? And hence, earlier I mentioned about Alaska and the rest of the Arctic Circle. Aside from Alaska and the Arctic Circle, or examples for the parts of the Arctic Circle, much of Siberia or the Siberian Plateau have permafrost. Tibetan Plateau, that's actually further down from the Arctic Circle, you find permafrost formation. Much of the Alaskan state contains permafrost. Huge proportion of northernmost Canada that actually kind of either polar or circumpolar have permafrost formations that are like hundreds or thousands of years in age. Much of the Greenlanders have it, and the same thing regarding the northernmost stretch of Scandinavian countries. Um, so earlier I did mention that the Arctic is warming, and in certain cases that warming rate could be twice as fast as the warming trends observed for the rest of the world. So to talk a little bit more about the importance of permafrost and how global warming leads to permafrost thawing, let me explain a little bit more about how it happens, right? So first, let me talk to you about what is known as the active layer. Active layer is the top part of the soil that does undergo freezing during winter, but it's not part of the permafrost. So our active layer of soil is actually the part that overlies the permafrost. So that part undergoes freezing during winter, and when summer comes, it actually undergo nearly complete thawing. Right now, that thawing is extremely helpful for the active layer because that's what sustains life. Right, that kind of active layer thawing provides suitable um, growing conditions for plant life, and it creates wetlands and lakes, particularly what's known as um, thermocrust lakes. Right, the wording is over here. Right, and thermocrust wetlands are formed when this active layer undergoes complete thawing. It actually creates extremely diverse habitats that is providing so much resources. Those these wetlands and lakes that overlie permafrost are rich in variety of forms of berries, cranberry, for example, and sedges and grasses, which provide and lichens, which provides very important food resources and habitats and breeding grounds, nesting grounds for a variety of Arctic wildlife, including Arctic mammals as well as Arctic birds and Arctic insects. So all of that only happens if the permafrost does not thaw, only active layer thaws, right? But if the but what happens with increasing atmospheric temperatures, the ground gets heated up, so the active layer starts deepening, right? So if the active layer starts deepening, more and more um, soil undergoes thawing, right? It could undergo all the way to the permafrost, and then the permafrost starts thawing, right? So what happens when the soil underlying active layer thaws? The microbial communities in the soil starts to become active, right? The root zone deepens for the vegetation, right? And that actually creates or enhances biological activities within the soil, and when the soil becomes biologically active, the metabolism of the soil becomes enhanced. As a result, it will release a lot more carbon dioxide, right, to the atmosphere. So as a result, you are going to get an increased carbon dioxide accumulation in the atmosphere, which contributes to increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, resulting in more global warming. So in fact, what prevents this deepening of the active layer, or which prevents the permafrost from thawing, is actually the peat, right? So peat is what? Peat is simply partly decomposed vegetation that accumulates in water saturated environments, right? So what happens over here is when dead organic matter, dead vegetation accumulates in water saturated environment, because the environment is water saturated, there is not enough oxygen for full decomposition. So that's why the partial decomposition happens, and the partially decomposed peat packs very tightly with each other and creates a thick layer. So the previous slide I was explaining about what peat does. So I want you to consider peat as a layer within the subterranean environment that separates the active layer from the permafrost, right? So what has been happening so far is actually with the dryness in Arctic that happens with global warming, right? The peat layer could be completely burnt up in an Arctic wildfire, because peat has so much partially decomposed carbon. It can get easily undergo combustion with plenty of oxygen, right? So if you remove this peat layer, if the peat layer gets burnt up with wildfire, it directly exposes the underlying permafrost, right? Which also enhances the greenhouse effect, which also which furthers the permafrost melting, then leading into global warming. Um, and also, I earlier did mention about this karst lakes and wetlands. Those are the depressional wetlands that are overlying um, permafrost, which results in when the active layer undergoes melting. Um, Now, I did mention those are very important habitats for Arctic wildlife. So, if the underlying permafrost actually undergoes melting and thawing, the entire lakes and the wetlands can also further collapse, right? And could drain completely. As you can see in my images, the image on to the bottom left is actually an active, biologically active thermokarst lakes and wetland systems. To the right, you are looking at what happens to those wetlands and lakes when the underlying permafrost melts, right? The water has completely drained, leaving this barren, open, mucky, muddy lands that doesn't provide any suitable habitats for any ecological function for that matter, right? So in fact, like I think I mentioned earlier, aside from this aquatic and wetland systems, the Arctic circle, the Arctic ecosystems are largely comprised of tundra habitats, tundra biomes, right? So those tundra biomes, are also overlying, those are dry lands overlying permafrost. If the permafrost starts collapsing, those tundra will also collapse and resulting in those slumps that are somewhat similar to these dried out or completely drained thermokarst lakes. Again, that kind of systems cannot hold vegetation and they actually kind of become barren land that are not useful for any wildlife. Another problem that we are recently discovering that happens as a result of permafrost melt is that melting permafrost may expose lots of diseases, right? So certain kind of diseases that are very virulent, highly infectious diseases um, could or are stored right now beneath the soil, right, beneath the permafrost, right? So diseases that existed before permafrost formation or when the permafrost were much more thinner may be, buried underneath the permafrost. Think about um, wildlife or even humans, dying with a disease and then undergoing complete burial, deep underneath the permafrost. What happens when the snow undergoes melting, it exposes the ground, and that actually undergoes melting of the active layer, that undergoes melting of the permafrost, ultimately exposing these deeply buried corpses that may have actually died out of diseases, and there's a very high risk of certain deadly infections coming back um, because of the melting snow cover and melting permafrosts. So what are the cumulative impacts of climate change on ecosystems? Well, first we are looking at changes in temperature at global scale. Sea surface temperature, earth surface temperature, water temperature, so so on. Um, so changes in temperature, leads to changes in resource distribution across the planet because temperature drives the metabolism, temperature drives the growth of vegetation and of organisms. And temperature drives most of the biogeochemical cycles and drives all the weather patterns. So as a result, temperature change will inevitably lead to changes in resource regimes. Um, with that, if the resource distribution is different, then the habitat structure, the habitat distribution, habitat extents will also change with climate change. Um, Now that will lead into many changes in environmental variables that are important, that are determinants of occupancy and abundance of organisms. So this also, collectively leads to changes in the bioclimatic envelope. Now, what is bioclimatic envelope? It's actually the overall um, environmental conditions, generally climatic or conditions that determines the distribution and ranges of species, right? So bioclimatic envelopes or bioclimatic ranges are being determined basically based on um, climatic variables like temperature, precipitation, humidity, and stuff like that. So ultimately, with changes in the bioclimatic envelopes and all of those changes in the environmental conditions, you are looking at greatly modified ecosystem processes. For example, you could be looking at modified hydrologic cycles, modified patterns of rainfall, modified hydrologic processes. So altogether, with this much massive amount of changes in the physical environment, you are going to experience new evolutionary selection forces being at play. So with that, like now you have new evolutionary forces that are exerting a pressure on life forms, right? So which actually now there are new forces driving evolutionary pathways, right? So bottom line for everything I've been telling you, when the environment changes this dramatically, from multiple aspects, right? Species in terms of evolution, right, or survival have, three basic options. They can either adapt. Well, species do adapt, and some of the species have shown adaptations to the changing climate. So that's one option. Second option um, is actually move, migrate, go somewhere else, right? Move away from a less suitable habitat to a more suitable habitat. If a species can disperse, if they are very agile, if they can move, yeah, that's a good option, right? So, well, yeah, birds do that for the most of the time, and bats do that to a certain extent as well. The third option is actually not an option itself, right? But unfortunately, a significant proportion of wildlife, in short term, if not have already succumbed in future, might actually succumb to these novel selection forces and die. In fact, there are few amphibians that have already perished solely because of climate change. So, speaking of these adaptive responses, how do species respond adaptively um, to climate change? So, one way is actually adapting through physiological responses, where the internal physiology, the metabolism, and resultant growth and development of organisms could change or can change with respect to climate change. The second pathway is phenological modifications. So what is phenology first? Phenology, in simply, well, you have all taken ecology, so you are expected to know what phenology is. But simply, phenology is, or phenology refers to the timing of different events within an organism's life cycle, right? This could include when a particular tree produce seeds, when would a particular plant produce flowers, right? When would certain seeds start to sprout? When certain animals mate? When do certain animals start reproducing? Um, when certain animals migrate, right, from one location to the other, all of those critical events within an organism's life cycle are parts of that particular organism's phenology. The timing is actually what we are going to talk about here. The timing of different events of a life cycle is the phenological alteration that I'm going to elaborate on later on. So what triggers the phenological events? What triggers the timing of life cycle activities is actually triggered by environmental signals. Largely it's temperature, right? To a certain degree, it's changes in the length of the day versus night time. And to some degree, the moisture, wetness, humidity, onset of rainfall can also trigger phenological events. So through the evolutionary history, the organism's life cycle co-evolved with the seasonality, because seasonality in a particular habitat, in a particular ecosystem, in a particular landscape has been more or less constant. So as a result, it makes sense why timing of life history events could co-evolve in response to in response to the precise environmental conditions. So there is a coupling that has evolved where organisms correspond perfectly to the best time of a particular year, of a particular season, um, to carry on their critical biological activities. But with climate change, you could experience decoupling of these relationships, right? Certain organisms, um, may, certain life history events may not happen perfectly, um, coinciding with the seasonality, right? And I will explain some of those things later on. More right now, I'm just throwing out the concept to you. Changes in the distribution, um, meaning shifting in the geographical range of certain species can happen over here, right? So in this case, certain species can shift further towards higher latitudes, mostly moving towards northern latitudes, or some organisms may shift from lower elevations to higher elevations. So you will experience shifting in distribution patterns as well, which is some sort of a migration or dispersal driven response to climate change. So, what if you don't remember what phenology is from your ecology lecture? Well, this may be a good time to look it up. Spend some time studying yourself. Now, what is a phenological shift? Well, it's actually shifting of those critical life history events is what is known as a phenological shift. Well, if you are not familiar with that term, this is a good time to look it up because these are background material that I expect you to know. And before you progress to the rest of the lecture, I want you to think yourself about any examples that you can come up with regarding shifts in organisms' phenology in response to climate change. And also think about why does that matter to you, right? To the human society. Are we completely independent of phenological shift that we have been observing in wildlife? Well, that's the pair share moment for you. Now I'm going to go over several examples for mismatches in the phenology, right? In other words, I'm going to talk to you about how life history events of a particular organism can become decoupled from the optimal climatic conditions. Okay, so one example, the first example is this guy, right? That is Bates checkerspot butterfly. The species considered endangered according to the Endangered Species Act of the USA. Um, and it's endemic to the San Francisco Bay Area of California. It only has very few suitable host plants, right? There are two species. The top one, the Indian paintbrush, is actually the primary host plant, and the one on the bottom, dwarf plantain, is a secondary host plant. Um, Now, what is the host plant for a butterfly? Now, that is actually the plants on which these guys lay eggs. That's where the larval development happens, right? The adults do not necessarily spend much time on the host plants. It's the larvae, the caterpillar, that relies on the host plant for the completion of their life cycles. So the problem, comes with that guy, that little larvae, right? So the larval period of the checker sport butterfly is more than a single season, right? So as a result, they actually have to first emerge, feed on the vegetation, then becomes dormant, spend the winter, and re-emerge again, and happening that for several seasons to complete its entire larval period, right? So we are looking at repeated dormancy and active period, right? In order for the caterpillar to maximize its foraging on the host plants, its re-emergence from dormancy or emergence from the eggs should perfectly coincide with the leaf out or the sprouting of the host plant after the winter, right? If they match perfectly, then of course the larvae has plenty of time to feed and accumulate enough calories to spend the winter as well as for the rest of the development of the caterpillar to take place. But if there's a mismatch, what do you mean by a mismatch? What if the caterpillar emerges um, later than emergence? I'm sorry. What if there's a mismatch between the caterpillar emergence and the emergence of the annual food plant? Well, let's assume that with the warming trends that we have been experiencing in the Western US, what if the host plant sprouts up earlier in the season, earlier in the winter, and the caterpillar emerges later? Well, then there will be not enough time for the caterpillar to feed, because the caterpillars usually prefer to feed the younger, immature, palatable leaves, right? If the caterpillar emerges late, right, the leaves of the host plant could have become more impalatable or may have matured too much for the caterpillar to feed on. Or, like I earlier mentioned, the caterpillar may not have enough time to forage before the onset of fall, right? These plants are annual, so they actually completely die by the end of summer. Sometimes they may not even last the entire summer, right? And since this caterpillar grows like this, um, for multiple seasons, right? This coincidence should happen in every season, right? If one of them mismatches, the caterpillar might die, might not survive the winter, right? And another problem could be what if the caterpillar does not become dormant and the winter comes up early? Well, that also could easily kill the caterpillar. So the mismatch between the plant's senescence and the larval emergence, right, could actually result in um, declining of this butterfly. In fact, this is happening in many parts of the San Fran Bay area, where the plant undergoes maybe early senescence because of early winter and early emergence because of early spring, but the butterfly larvae may not actually readjust its timing of its life cycle um, following the adjustments made by the plant itself. So that could actually result in declining populations of this particular unique and already endangered butterfly. Now, know that this butterfly is rare by nature, right? This kind of phenomena will only drive it more towards extinction. Okay, let's talk about another example, much more detailed example about the phenological mismatch. First, let's look at this guy, the winter moth. It's a lepidopteran that occupying a broad range of habitats in the temperate zone, mostly within the subarctic environment. The larvae is polyphagous, meaning it can feed on many species of plants, and occupies many species of plants as their host plant. um, they are able to feed on different varieties of oaks, right? Mostly hardwood. They do not feed on softwood or on pines. So what's happening is actually with the warming trends that the entire temperate and the subarctic environment experience, hardwoods are leafing out earlier, right? So these early leaves, right, those young immature leaves are much more palatable for these larvae, um, and carries a lot of high quality nutrition. So these insects, like, have kind of over the time quickly evolved, adapted to the warming climates, to earlier spring. So their emergence, right, of this larvae, or the laying of the adults and the emergence of the larvae, perfectly matched the phenology of the oaks, right? So in such a way that, or when the young leaves are available in larger amounts, the larvae are out feeding. So that's perfect. Well, what's the problem then? Well, think about what kind of predators rely on these larvae as food items. That's the next slide about. So this is the European pied flycatcher, right? It feeds on the winter moth that I explained earlier on. It's a migratory species. A European residential species migrates to Africa, tropical Africa, to overwinter and comes back during spring, right? And the study I've read documents, particularly within Netherlands, right, about over 95%, over 90% of populations suffered about over 90% decline of the pied flycatcher over a 20-year period. That's a massive amount of declines, right? And it used to be a very fairly common species, but now, like in the future, it may not be so much common because of this incident. So, like I mentioned earlier, these guys are actually feeding on the winter moth, right? So I explained earlier that the winter moth, aptly named it's winter moth because it's highly adaptive, they actually emerge earlier, following up the greater abundance of forage forage. So the peak abundance of these caterpillars are no longer matching the arrival of these migratory flycatchers, right? So if you look at the graph, it actually explains what it details what I am about to explain very, very well. Look at let me take my pointer right now. Here we go. So this part, this particular figure, the two figures to the left, right? The top one is actually is related to the bird. The bottom one is the caterpillar biomass, right? So generally around 1980s, right? Historically, these birds produce eggs. The peak egg laying is around April 23rd, right? And then the eggs hatch around May 15, and then the young birds fledge around June 2nd, right? So with this kind of a life history events, right? These developing birds, these hatchlings, are in high demand for food, right? During in between May 15th to June 2nd, right? So in other words, kind of the May 28th is kind of the peak foraging time for these particular birds, right? I mean, I'm talking about these adult birds needing to forage for themselves as well as for their developing hatchlings, right? So historically, that's the condition, right? Historic peak um, caterpillar abundance is around May 28th. Perfect, because that's exactly when the bird hatchlings are required to be fed. Now, let's look at the modern day data, right? This is post year 2000, right? Well, if you compare the left and right sides of the bird graph, their egg laying date has not changed despite changes in the temperature, and their developmental rate hasn't changed. As a result, the hatching date and the fledging dates remains the same, right? And the peak of the hatchling food demand still remains the same. Now let's look at the bottom figures, compare left and right regarding caterpillar biomass. Historically, the caterpillar peaked their biomass around May 28th. Now it comes about 2 weeks earlier, around May 15th, right? So what's happening over here is actually when the birds are in high demand for food, the caterpillar biomass is at the lowest. It doesn't help, right? Why it is happening? Because like I explained earlier, the oak leaves are sprouting up earlier. In response to them, the caterpillars have evolved faster to match themselves to the changing vegetation phenology. But birds are evolving slower, so they are still doing things business as usual. So there is a mismatch, decoupling of the food abundance with the time when the food is mostly needed. As a result, like I explained just a little while ago, many populations of this bird are in decline. So another interesting question that I want you to ask now is actually why one species evolved faster, why another species doesn't. Well, the reason is quite simple, right? Insects have a shorter life cycle, right? Um, and these winter moths reproduce annually every season. So they have a faster reproduction rate, faster generation turnover rate, meaning their population can undergo mutations faster, right? They can generate mutations faster through sexual reproduction. They can generate new combinations of alleles faster, right? So as a result, the gene pool, the allele frequencies can change faster, right? They can the selection happens faster for those populations because they reproduce faster. Birds, well, they of course do reproduce every season. Well, generally the populations do reproduce every season, but every single bird may not reproduce every season. Sometimes they could forego a particular reproductive season because for birds, reproduction costs a lot of energy. On the other hand, unlike moths grow faster. It takes years for a bird to reach reproductive maturity. So not every bird can reproduce every year anyways. There's a time frame, a lag time for them to achieve reproductive success. Insects reproduce in massive numbers, right? Birds do not reproduce in large numbers. This particular species produce fewer than 10 eggs, probably actually an average of like what, somewhere around 5, and not all of the eggs may survive. So there's a lower survival rate for them. So couple, all together, because of the slower reproductive cycle, um, the rate of evolution is slower in birds, much faster in insects. So that's actually the reason you see this mismatch. So this can be generalized for many other species, right? Birds, mammals, right, takes a long time to evolve new traits, right? Takes a long time for changes in the allele frequencies, right? Takes forever to accumulate, to accrue new mutations. But within the insect world, within the invertebrate world, that happens much faster because of the faster generation time and because of the faster growth cycle. Um, yep, that's actually one example. Let's continue on to several other interesting examples. Another example, many species of shorebirds, sandpipers and plovers to be a little bit more precise, they migrate from Latin American countries, from South and Central America, and sometimes even from the southern US towards the Arctic to breed. The reason why they do that is, as you guys already know, during summer or during early spring, when Arctic warms up, provide ideal habitats for insects, and those insects are a great food resource for both the adult birds as well as for their hatchlings. So that's a long migration coming from Latin America all the way to the Arctic, right? So they actually lose most of their energy reserves halfway, somewhere around Delaware Bay, as a reason within the northeastern United States. They actually have to take a rest. They have to take a break where they actually stop for feeding. They quickly forage, mostly, on horseshoe crabs on the coastal waters of the northeastern US, and replenish the energy and completes the rest of the migration. And this staging, this kind of halfway feeding point, is extremely important, not only to continue the rest of the migration but to develop energy reserves that are extremely important when they lay eggs, right? So in order for foraging at Delaware Bay to be important, right, the migrating birds should arrive in Delaware Bay right at the time when horseshoe crabs are actually laying eggs, right? So there should be a perfect timing of emergence of horseshoe crabs and the arrival of the Delaware Bay, arrival of the birds, shorebirds at Delaware Bay, right? The same thing happens in the Arctic, right? Birds should arrive ahead of time so that they can nest and lay eggs and have hatchlings ready to be fed when the insect starts to bloom, right? If they arrive too late, well, of course, the insects might have died out, right? They can't arrive too early, but that's not the problem, right? They have to arrive a little bit ahead of the time at the Arctic so that they can make nests, mate, and lay eggs, and have hatchlings ready to be fed with the blooming insects. Um, And yes, I did mention this one too, that the bird's arrival at the staging site should perfectly coincide with crab spawning, right? Both of those events, crab emergence, crab spawning, and insects blooming, are highly temperature mediated, right? It is a temperature that acts as the environmental cue to drive both of those phenological events. Warming climates have resulted in early spawning of crabs. So they emerge on the shore earlier, way earlier than the arrival of birds. The same thing happening to the Arctic insect. Arctic is getting warmer earlier, so insects are emerging earlier. So there's a dual mismatch between Arctic birds' arrival at staging site, the stopaway, as well as at the Arctic breeding ground. Right, in both occasions they are not mismatched. There's a mismatch. So there's not enough food for these adult birds to breed. B, there's not enough food, even if they would arrive there, there would not be enough food to feed the hatchlings, right? And that will do two things. One, it may create a problem for the survival of the adult birds. They are running out of their fat reserves. Two, even if they were to survive, they will not produce high quality eggs because there's not enough yolk to be placed into the eggs, right? Three, even if they produce eggs, right, um, there may not be enough yolk for the hatchlings to develop. Another problem, even if the hatchlings were to emerge from the eggs, now there will not be enough insects in the Arctic environment um, to feed the new hatchlings, right? So that actually have resulted in massive declines in the shorebird population sizes. Mm. Similar problems, similar mismatches between food abundance and birds phenology have been explored and documented for great deeds in Europe. Okay, now a food for thought for you, right? A pair share moment for you to do it on your own. So we talked about climate change being bad, and yeah, some animals could die, bird populations could decline. Um, so what? Well, over the long run, like some of those birds may kick back, right? If not, that's bad luck, right? They will disappear, right? So that's what nature is all about, right? Um, Humans are still going to be fine. Um, but is that true? Okay, are we actually are humans going to be completely immune to the environmental consequences of climate change, right? And can birds actually evolve back? I kind of gave you a hint regarding that. um, if you compare the life cycle of invertebrates versus vertebrates, the longevity of invertebrates versus vertebrates, the reproduction rates between vertebrates and invertebrates differ quite a lot. Right? Okay, that actually says a lot about the chances of evolution or the probability of evolution. Well, also think about, can a trait evolve out of blue? No, there should be some sort of a genetic backbone, right? Some sort of a genome, some kind of a allele for mutation to happen, right? So the question, bottom line, the question is, can evolution solve this problem? Provided that evolution happens amidst so many constraints. Now, you all have taken evolution. You all have not taken evolution, but you all have taken ecology. That's good enough knowledge to answer this question. So dig deep into this question yourself and answer it. And you can actually get back to me through email with your answers to check back whether you're right or wrong. All right, that is the end of this particular part of climate change lecture.